Hello and welcome to this episode of Pimp My Retro PC. Yeah, I've seen lots of videos about people making sleepers and reverse sleepers and stuff. I didn't really think it was something I'd be interested in, but then the more I thought about it, I thought, I should give it a go. I've got loads of old parts of gaming PCs kicking around and stuff, so I bought a cheap case and grabbed a motherboard. So this was a long time in the making. A lot of things went wrong making this project, so I'm just going to go over the failures first, I think, and then we'll get into what I actually ended up doing. So the bits you see before you here were attempt 1. I chose a slot 1 motherboard because I thought slot 1 processors might be easier to mount a liquid cooler to than your normal sort of ZIF socket type things. And I grabbed an old liquid cooler from an old gaming PC and see how it goes. So I actually think this would have worked, but I came across a few things I didn't like about it. First of all, I sort of had to prep the water cooler. So the water cooler had a bracket that obviously was bolted through to a backplate on a modern motherboard. So I didn't want that. So luckily this one just kind of clips off, which I did, removed it, and that just left for the sort of a round disc of the cooler itself. And then I took the cooler off the slot 1 processor, it was a Celeron in this case, and it has 2 holes that's like pegged onto the back with a bracket, and I thought they would make a great place to run some kind of fastener through so that I could clamp the liquid cooler onto the processor. But in the end I very quickly discarded this idea because I suddenly realised that the water cooler would be facing downwards, and I wanted to see the water cooler in the case because it's got an LED in it and I wanted bling, so very quickly decided to discard the slot 1 as a possibility. I decided to do it with a socket 370 and see if I could get a normal sort of seated processor clamped onto the water cooler in some manner, and this is where things start to go a bit wrong, so be warned. Mostly due to my own stupidity. Some of it wasn't my fault. So this was the processor I chose, and it's a Celeron, a Mendocino core Celeron, and this board was a compact board from a compact PC that I had for a short while in my IBM socket 370 system, just because that didn't have an AGP port and this one does. And the last processor to run in this board was a Coppermine 1 GHz processor. Now I was confident that this board worked because everything was hunky-dory with it the last time I used it. And anybody who does retro computing ought to know being confident is always a mistake. So the next part of this was all about, I spent a lot of time just trying to get the damn water cooler attached and sort of endless iterations of trying to get it clamped on and then cleaning things up and then trying again and so forth. So I got it attached to the processor in the end, and it wasn't pretty, but it's secure. And this is the case I'm going to use, and I didn't choose it in particular for any reason. It was just the cheapest possible glass case I could find with LED fans. So I was just going to go with this as it is out the box. And I totally forgot about this project. It was sitting on a shelf and I was doing some tidying up, and it all started, well, I don't know, it might have even been a year ago, certainly a good few months ago, when somebody on, I think it was Twitter, showed me an amazing job that they'd done on theirs, doing a sort of reverse sleeper like this, and I thought I'd give it a go, and I bought the case and put it on the shelf and totally forgot about it. I will get back to exactly how I attached the cooler using the cable ties in a while. There's a reason why I'm not doing it now, which you'll find out about shortly. And everything else was pretty straightforward. It dropped straight in, all of the posts were already in the right place, and then I got the radiator. It had to go on the back just because I didn't think, I was kind of learning a lot about this as I went along. I didn't orientate the pipes coming out of the cooler to where I wanted the fan to go, which was on the top, and without putting too much of a kink in the water pipes, it had to go on the back, so I swapped it out with the existing case fan. The rest of the build was pretty straightforward. Got the lights working, and then it was time to boot it up, and this was where things started going wrong. So if you observed what I was doing, I was putting together a computer without even testing the motherboard to see if it worked, which is, well, it's stupid, isn't it? And when it did come to boot, I got this rather strange error message where it says the microcode in the BIOS doesn't support this processor, which was a bit strange. I know this was a Mendocino core, not a Coppermine, but since Mendocino Celerons were kind of before Coppermine, and if you bought a Mendocino motherboard, you'd do a BIOS upgrade and then it would take Coppermine. I was fully expecting this to be backward compatible. Now I know this processor works because it was in another machine recently, but whatever. So I took it out, I tried my Coppermine processors and didn't get much further. So the Coppermine processors didn't sort of kick off this error, but they only got as far as the compact splash screen, and then the machine would go no further. So I'm guessing that the BIOS on this machine is now knackered and I have to reflash it, which I wasn't going to do now. So that was the end of the Socket 370 experiment. And at this point I'd run out of thermal paste because I swapped processors so many times, I'd used it all. And I thought, I can't be bothered thinking about processors anymore. So this gave me some breathing space while I was waiting for a new thermal paste to arrive before I looked for another motherboard, to pay attention to the cosmetics of the case, which was something I wasn't even going to bother doing originally because I was just going to go with the fans that came with it. The horrible green flashing things were sort of nausea inducing, so I decided I'd do something about that in the few days I had while I was waiting for thermal paste to come. So lighting wise, I had this old vintage cold cathode tube light that I thought I want in there in some way, so that's kind of stuck in the corner behind the fans because that was the only place that's long enough to take it, because this is a sort of quite squat case. And then the other thing that I decided to do was replace those horrible green flashing fans with static colour fans, because this thing came with a built-in LED RGB controller at the back, and obviously there's no way to control that because the software won't run in Windows 98. It's probably designed for Windows 10, so anything that needs any kind of software controls out the window. So I got rid of the fans that are in the case and replaced it with some blue ones. And then we come to yet another motherboard. I promise this is the last motherboard that will be in this video, and this is the one that we'll continue the project with. It's an Asus A7N8X Deluxe board. It's socket 462, aka socket A, and we're going to be running an Athlon Thunderbird in this, an Athlon Thunderbird 1300. So this is going to be the board. It's a good choice as well because the socket A was such a long-lived socket. As you got into the later 462 versions of it, you get some sort of more modern features. So this one's got SATA and it's got, you know, USB headers for case connectors and things like that, which are going to be useful with the modern case. You'll be pleased to know that I have tested this and it does work. We can get cracking to get the water cooler on this thing, and we'll go into a bit more detail about how I did it, or my learning experiences from the Socket 370, which is the sort of method that we're going to use here. So I ran a zip tie around the bottom of the socket and ran it specifically underneath the lugs that you would loop the attachment of your air cooler onto, so that sort of stops the band that you create with the zip tie pulling up off the socket, which gives you something to anchor onto. And then you do a similar thing on the water cooler, because the water cooler has these kind of lugs that its fittings were attached to, and you can loop a zip tie around the top of that. So effectively you create a band around this and a band around the socket on the motherboard, and then you can use some other zip ties looped around each one to pull the things together. Well, that's the plan. It did take a couple of attempts to get this to work, which is why the colour of the zip ties keeps changing every time you look at them. But in the end we went with red, rather fetching shade of red. I created the loops and pulled the thing together. It did lift off one corner, but it wasn't, I don't think it's really a problem. It has caught securely around the fasteners for the air cooler, and it ended up being pretty solid and flat against the chip. And then It's just a case of getting the motherboard in. This board's a bit bigger than the socket 371, but it seems to all be set up correctly for it anyway. So got that in, and this time I was a bit more careful about orienting the water tubes so that they pointed in the correct direction so that I could get that radiator up onto the roof of the case. Next, something I don't often get to do with machines of this vintage, proper cable management. That's all really down to the case. Cable management rather than the motherboard. If you can get that power supply out of the way, which you never can in proper retro cases, all things become neat and tidy. So even using the IDE cable for a hard drive is going to just slide in quite a nice, neat way. And of course, there's loads of sort of space at the back just to cram all of the extra length away. The hard drive on this is quite cool. I was a bit worried that it wouldn't, have space for a full size sort of 3.5-inch hard drive, but it does, and it sits on the bottom next to the power supply and screws in at the bottom, so that's cool. Wow, look at that. Neat and tidy IDE connection. I don't think I've ever seen one of those before. Just about there. Just need to hook up the front panel connectors. Got our USB header. So everything on the front panel's kind of hooked up, apart from the headphone jack won't work and the USB 3 won't work, but it's still sort of relatively functional, which is good. Just get some cards in there now, so we're going to put a Sound Blaster Live in, and for graphics I decided to go with some maybe slightly more advanced cards for Windows 98, just so I could use passive cooling and not introduce any rattling fans into what's going to be a lovely, smooth and relatively silent machine, I think. So this is a GeForce 4 MX440, which I think is just basically a GeForce 2 MX400 with more memory bandwidth, I think. So that should be able to deal with your Windows 98 and DOS games. And with everything hooked up, we can plug it in and make sure it all still works. And look at all the bling.
Wow!
Yeah, and I'm pretty pleased with that. I think it looks pretty smart. Pretty smart for a retro machine. Now that I know everything works, I can put the case back together so all the cables are nice and flat on the back, and we can get the back panel back on. Then flip it over and get the tempered glass panel back on and stand it up, and let's take a look. That's it. Finally, a working retro reverse sleeper. After all of that hassle with all those other motherboards, it's all been worthwhile. I ran a little experiment with the CPU temperature before I took the air cooler off. I had a look in Everest Home Edition to see what the temperature was at idle for the processor, and it was 36 degrees. And then I got Prime 95, which is a tool that overclockers use for burning in and stress testing their systems after an overclock. And I set that on its most vicious setting and let that run for half an hour, and the temperature went up to 47 degrees. And these are degrees centigrade. After the water cooler went on, I did the same thing again, and in Prime 95, idle was 26 degrees. So this thing idles 10 degrees cooler now than it used to on air. And then when I ran the half-hour stress test, it only went up to 33 degrees. So with the water cooler on, under stress, it still runs cooler than it did on idle with air, which is quite cool. And just in case I forget that this is a retro machine, I better put some retro stickers on. So the usual Geek and Spiel stickers go across the bottom, I think, to make it sort of relatively unobtrusive. But yeah, it looks kind of weird having those stickers against a LED fan. Of course, with it running so much cooler, I had to try a little bit of an overclock. Now, I've tried to overclock this chip before and didn't get very far with it. But this time it sailed straight through. Well, I got an extra 100 megahertz out of it, so nothing terribly dramatic. But I couldn't get that far on air the last time I tried it. And that was without messing about with voltage or anything. It was just messing about with the base frequency and the multiplier, and got it running stably instantly at 1400, so that was pretty good. And I tried to push it a little bit and get an extra 50 megahertz out of it, and then it was just giving floating point errors in Prime 95, and it was also glitching when I was running 3D Mark. So I tried to start feeding some voltage into it at that point, and even when I maxed it out, and this current BIOS only lets me add 1 volt in total to the CPU's vCore, and that still didn't help. So I reduced it with various sort of combinations of multiplier and base frequency, and the most I managed to get out, got an extra 14 megahertz I got out of it. So it's running at 1414 at the minute, which is better than nothing. So the next issue we're going to have with this for retro stuff is getting things onto it, because there's no optical drive, there's no floppy drive, which means we're going to have to rely entirely on USB. So we're going to try these 3 things we've got here: a USB CD-ROM, a USB floppy disk, and a USB stick. And I'm pleased to say they all went pretty well. Some of them are temperamental. The CD wouldn't work on the front panel connector, whereas the floppy disk and the stick did work on the front panel connector, but the CD drive does work fine as long as it's plugged into the motherboard USB port. So a bit strange, but as long as they all work, it wouldn't be much of a machine if I couldn't get games onto it. So that's what we'll do next. We'll load a few games and see if they work okay. And straight away, Broken Sword, the Sleeping Dragon, installed fine from the CD drive, but then when it came to run, it couldn't detect the CD in the CD drive, the USB CD drive. So I was a bit worried that some of this kind of thing might happen, but first game's a fail. And then I tried Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, and that installed fine, and that gave me a blue screen of death. So I don't think it's a problem with the machine so much as missing a DLL or something, so I'll sort that out later. And next I installed Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. Looks like this one came free on PC Gamer. Not sure where I got this. I think it was just a big haul of stuff. And this one thankfully installs fine and opens fine. So it's maybe 1 or 2 games might be temperamental, but hopefully this bodes well for the others. And to cut a long story short, I installed Black and White. That worked fine. I tried to install Star Wars Battle for Naboo. I got exactly the same blue screen that I got on the Episode 1 Racer, so I'm guessing that's, it's a DLL that LucasArts use for some of their games that's possibly missing off my Windows install, but I should be able to sort that out, I think. I copied a DOS game onto the machine just by dumping everything on there to see if that works, and yeah, that was absolutely fine as well. So I think I'll have some technical foibles with USB drives and stuff, but for the most part I think it should be fine. And that, as they say, is that. The end of this video, I think. It's been a long and sometimes tedious journey with failing motherboard components and getting tangled up with zip ties and such things, but I think it was worth it in the end. I also swapped out the graphics card. I forgot to mention that earlier. I found the FX 5200 with a blue PCB, which looks really nice in there. So I need to find a sound card with a blue PCB as well, and I think that'll really set the machine off with the blue lights. But yeah, it looks absolutely cool, I think, and I'm going to enjoy playing on it. Right now I'm going to play some Black and White because I missed that game totally back in the day and recently acquired it in a haul of stuff I got on eBay. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed watching the video and coming on this crazy journey to build this spectacular thing. And if you did, it'd be great if you consider giving me a thumbs up, leaving a comment, or subscribing, or any of that other stuff. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you in the next video.
Thank you. Thank you for your mercy.
We praise you. Greetings, we're your conscience, good and evil, yin and yang, black and white, As part of you, we'll guide you through this world.